Good morning, this is Travis Shaw with the Mosby Heritage Area Association, welcoming you to our special Veterans Day programming. It's November 11th, 2019. It's exactly 101 years since the guns fell silent at the end of the First World War. And although that was 101 years ago, the world that we live in was still very much shaped by that conflict. And to kind of commemorate the end of that conflict, we're going to be exploring areas all across the heritage area today, looking at how they were shaped by the First World War, how the First World War shaped not only those who went overseas to fight, but those who stayed here at home and helped fight from the home front. And to help us with that, we've got a historian here, James Taub. He's a World War I expert. He'll be providing some expert commentary, some expert context to our local stories that we'll be sharing. So we're going to begin today in Leesburg. Leesburg, the seat of Loudoun County, but it's also the home to wartime Governor Westmoreland Davis. Davis moves to Leesburg in 1903. He purchases Morphin Park on the north side of town, and it's going to be his home for the next several decades. And any discussion of Virginia in World War I has to begin with Westmoreland. He is really directing Virginia's wartime, wartime efforts from the governor's seat, very top down. Davis is first and foremost interested in agriculture. He's going to be spreading kind of ideas of scientific agriculture throughout Virginia, throughout the South. That is going to become integral to Virginia's war effort, raising food and livestock to feed the troops, horses for the war effort to haul artillery and supplies. So that is going to become one of the main thrusts of his kind of governorship during the war. He is also going to lead the drive to buy war bonds. There's photographs of him here in Leesburg buying thousands of dollars worth of war bonds. He is going to spend time down Norfolk, basically greeting troops as they embark to go over to the Western Front. His wife, Marguerite, is going to be heavily involved in the nursing effort. She's also going to take kind of a stint at the Seven Pines Munitions Manufactory just outside of Richmond. You know, all of these very heavily publicized kind of press opportunities to show that the governor, his wife, are just as involved in the war effort as regular, everyday Virginians. That's going to kind of round back around at the end of the war right here at the Loudoun County Courthouse, when Westmoreland Davis himself is going to oversee the celebrations as the troops return home. The troops will parade right through this intersection here at King and Market. They are going to have a party here on the courthouse grounds. By all accounts, it goes late into the evening till 1 o'clock in the morning as these veterans and their families celebrate the end of the war along with Governor Davis and his wife. So, could you maybe add a little bit to what we're talking about, the war effort as far as Virginia is concerned?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like the rest of the United States, Virginia isn't necessarily prepared to enter the war when the United States as a whole joins the conflict in April of 1917. And this is a conflict that's been raging since August of 1914. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't Virginians already taking part in the war effort. Of course, the United States economically was very heavily supplying the Allies, particularly the British Empire, in their war efforts. As well, you have Virginians volunteering for service in foreign armies. You have Virginians serving with the famous Lafayette Escadrille, the Lafayette Flying Corps in the French Army. Later today, when we're down in Warrenton, we'll meet a young captain of the Irish Guards who's from Warrenton and was a VMI graduate who was wounded on the Battle of the Somme a full year before the United States enters the war. But when the U.S. actually enters the war, Virginia takes part in this massive upheaval of society, which mobilizes itself for the first major war in American history being fought overseas. We've seen Americans sent overseas in the Mexican-American War, in the Spanish-American War, but 4 million men and women will be in uniform by the end of the First World War. 2 million of those will be going overseas, particularly to France and Belgium. To a lesser extent, you also see service as part of the Russian Civil War in Archangel and in Siberia. Within Virginia itself, you have soldiers forming the core nucleus of the 29th Division, particularly the 116th Infantry, which are mainly men from the Shenandoah Valley, as well as Northern Virginia and the Mosby Heritage area. We'll be meeting a few of them later today. as well as the men forming part of the new Army, the 80th Division, the Blue Ridge Division. Half of its 4 infantry regiments are comprised of Virginia troops, a large chunk of those coming from Northern Virginia. Now, it's also important to remember that, unfortunately, the United States Army was still segregated during the period of the First World War, and we'll also be exploring that African-American experience, particularly in relation to Northern Virginia during the First World War. Virginia helped supply a large quantity of food supplies, of war materiel, as well. 1 out of every 5 doughboys is going to ship out of Norfolk, and when we talk a bit more about Westmoreland Davis, we'll hear some more about that. So Virginia, just like in all previous and future American conflicts, is integral to the American war effort, and particularly these 6 counties here in Northern Virginia, which we'll be exploring later today.
One thing I do want to talk about before we move on, though, is kind of our memory of the First World War. You know, in my mind, it's almost a forgotten conflict. You know, it gets overshadowed by the Second World War, it gets overshadowed by, of course, the Civil War, particularly in this area, and yet, what, 114,000 Americans lose their lives?
Yeah, World War I is our 3rd bloodiest war, and the vast majority of American casualties are going to occur in the second half of 1918, particularly in the fall, where you have 2 things occurring. You have the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which to this day remains America's largest and bloodiest battle. That lasts from September the 26th to November the 11th, 1918, which coincides with the arrival of Spanish flu, hitting both the United States as well as the troops serving overseas in Europe. So when you think about it, we are only in World War I from April 1917 until November 1918, and it's still our 3rd bloodiest war, as compared to the Civil War, which lasted 4.5 years, and World War II, which was just about the same. If we were in World War I the entire extent of time that all the other nations were, it would have been our bloodiest war. World War I as well, when the soldiers and servicemen come back, changes the United States and makes it into the modern country that it is today. We like to think of the Civil War creating this American identity. The doughboys and their generation create this modern American, the idea of just going off, serving the country, coming back, living your life, and really creating this ideal as well of just what it means for an American to serve in modern society, and the place, particularly as we think about this on Veterans Day, of what the veterans' role in society is. Because when these men and women come back, they don't have the same systems that we have in place now for our veterans returning from service, and they're the ones who start that. They help create the VA. This is the generation that goes through and pulls the United States out of the Great Depression and leads them through the Second World War. And we like to think of the World War II generation as the greatest generation, but we have to remember that those young men and women of the World War II generation were being led by the young men and women of the World War I generation, who had seen and experienced this horrible conflict and didn't want their sons and daughters to go through that. So you have to understand that as we go into the Second World War and America enters really its golden age of foreign diplomacy and as a powerhouse on the world stage, that all comes out of the experience of the World War I generation.
That's a really fantastic point, because just a few blocks behind us, up the road, is the home of one of the men of that generation, and that's George Marshall, who, you know, his combat experience came out of the First World War, and he is one of the most important leaders of that World War II generation.
Absolutely, yeah, and you see, just based on we all know that World War I ended up leading into World War II, very much helped contribute to the start of the Second World War, and Marshall, he sees that. And that's why you get him as an amazing soldier. But one of the great things about Marshall and other Virginians and all the Americans who are serving this time period is they saw the mistakes that were made by their parent generation when they were negotiating the peace of World War I, and that heavily contributes to the ideas behind the Marshall Plan after the end of the Second World War.
Awesome. Well, we're going to continue this series through the rest of the day. We're going to hit a number of different sites all throughout the Heritage area. Our next stop, though, we're going to take a look at some of the individual soldiers who served from Loudoun County, and we're going to do that at the Loudoun County World War I Memorial. So I hope you'll join us in just a few minutes as we continue with our exploration of World War I in the Heritage area. Thank you.